Right, good day everyone. This is Rico de la Peña, and this is our first lecture in hydrogeology. And our topic is surface water and groundwater. This is a multi-part lecture, alright? And for this session, we will be discussing groundwater, aquifers, and springs, as well as hydrologic cycle and water budget. Now, just to put things in context, right? So this is a course on hydrogeology, and definitely we'll be discussing groundwater as a resource, and I found this relevant to include in the introduction to the course. This is an excerpt from a journalist covering the drought and the, let's say, unrest in Africa, right? I first heard, or rather, the first time I heard about the severity of drought in East Africa was through a friend when I was still studying for my master's in New Zealand. I had a friend who was from Kenya and he was studying water resources. And we had subjects or courses that tackled water resources. And he always commented how different it was in back in Africa. Like for example, in New Zealand, they define water crisis as something like in the levels of their lakes being polluted by farming. While in Africa, their definition of water crisis is 10 million people dying due to drought. So I saw that stark contrast. So I might as well read this excerpt. In Somalia, a well or a groundwater well is as precious as a town bank, controlled by warlords and guarded with weapons. During the region's relentless 3-year drought, water has become a resource worth fighting and dying over. The drought has affected an estimated 11 million people across East Africa and killed large numbers of livestock, leaving carcasses of cows, goats, and even hardy camels rotting in the sun. The governments of Kenya and Ethiopia have mediated dozens of conflicts over water in their countries, even sending in police and army to quell disputes around wells. Now, going back, so we are in the Philippines, we are surrounded by sea and rivers. You may not be able to imagine how this relates to the Philippines. Okay? Surprise, surprise, we actually had droughts. I mean, historically, we had droughts in the Philippines, although it is localized, meaning it we had droughts before, and they occur over provinces, right? Right, and we had numerous droughts, like almost over 10 droughts over in the recorded history of the Philippines, and the longest one uh, have have spanned as long as 3 years. Okay, so that's a big deal. I mean, you can imagine the recent water shortage in Metro Manila back in December 2020, and it was a pain in the ass to have or to deal with the low water pressure. And you can imagine having that problem, having no water for 3 years. Okay. All right. Let's proceed to the first part of this module, the groundwater, aquifers, and springs. Groundwater is essentially water below the land surface. By definition, the Palawan Underground River is groundwater. So any water that is below the land surface is groundwater. Now, aquifers, as per CRESIC 2009, consist of geologic formations of soil or rock, and the keywords here are economic extraction, potable water, and significant volumes. Now you will realize that the definition of aquifers is quite similar to the definition of ore minerals in a sense that it is a relative definition. Okay, so we peg the definition of aquifers to the economics of it. So any water that can be economically extracted and is potable and insignificant in volume is technically an aquifer, right? And you can see an example here, right, showing a block diagram of an aquifer. In this case, the aquifer is a sandstone, the Sherwood sandstone, and it is overlain by a mudstone, and then its underlying bedrock is Permian mudstones. Okay. Note that the aquifer has a mudstone, has an overlying mudstone which is relatively impervious or relatively low permeability. Okay, and we can further define this aquifer as a confined aquifer because it has a confining layer on top. Okay, now springs are locations where the groundwater pressure is enough to cause your water to surge out. Okay, and typically you have springs when you have confined aquifers. In terms of water supply, springs or rather large springs are important as they can be developed as into a water source by the construction of spring boxes. The diagram here is a schematic of a spring box, right? You can see here you have a housing typically made of concrete which impounds spring water and it collects water from a connected water bearing strata, right? And then you also have a filter system, okay, for water that is diverted into to your households or to your farms, whatever it is. And you also have an external collection access, or so you can access the spring box from the outside, okay. And it also has a cover to protect the spring from contamination from outside. Now let's define confined and unconfined aquifers. Confined aquifers have an overlying low permeability boundary or a low permeability formation, and this confinement allows pressure build up, right? Because as you accumulate water in a confined aquifer, the water basically can only move laterally. It can't move upward anymore because it has a confining layer. So this results in pressure buildup. Right now, for confined aquifers, when you extract water, what happens is you reduce the pressure in the confined aquifer, and as a result, okay, the loss of pressure results in your soil grains within the aquifer to stick together and possibly consolidate, okay, depending on the severity of the loss of pressure. In extreme cases where there is vigorous extraction of groundwater in your confined aquifer, this can lead to ground subsidence. Okay, and the thing with confined aquifers is you can imagine confined aquifers as a bladder of water. Okay, and as you squeeze out the water, okay, if you squeeze out a significant amounts of water, the bladder just loses water and it sort of shrinks in size. Okay, so confined aquifers generally do not easily recover, or they permanently lose. Um, they permanently undergo subsidence. Okay, now for the case of unconfined aquifers, which are generally open, extraction in unconfined aquifers typically just result in drop in water level. Okay, as you can see in the diagram here, this is a good representation of a confined aquifer. In some cases, the water pressure is large enough such that the soil grains in the confined aquifer are hardly touching, the meaning that the meaning the soil skeleton or the soil skeleton structure is hardly supporting the weight of the overburden above. Or in other words, there are confined aquifers where you have so much pressure that uh, parts of the overburden is being supported by water pressure. Okay. Now, when you extract that water from that confined aquifer, you start taking out water. You start taking out water pressure, and as a result, you slowly transfer the load or the overburden to the soil grains. Okay, and that results in consolidation for soft soil and compaction for granular soils. Okay, and it can be permanent. Okay, could be a permanent effect for the confined aquifer. Now let's differentiate water table versus piezometric level. Water table is simply the present level of groundwater given a time and a location, right? Note that water table fluctuates with your season, especially dry and wet season. You get water table fluctuations. In a sense, water table is just the literal water elevation of your water, okay? While piezometric level is the equilibrium level of your groundwater, particularly for confined aquifers, okay? In the case of unconfined aquifers, water table is just the same as piezometric level. And for the case of confined aquifers, the water level is often different from the piezometric surface or the piezometric level. As shown in this illustration, right? In this point, and you can see here the top portion of the aquifer here is the water table, but the piezometric surface is actually well beyond or well above your water table. Now, once you introduce a well which allows the aquifer to release its pressure, your water can actually rise, right, well into the piezometric level. Right now, let's talk about hydrologic cycle and water budget. Hydrologic cycle, this is basically how water is transmitted throughout your environment. And this involves the atmosphere in form of your precipitation, and then your lithosphere in form of runoff being um, in form of your watershed transforming precipitation into runoff, as well as your biosphere, which involves the evapotranspiration of water from your plants, and then to your hydrosphere, which involves the discharge of your runoff to the sea or to a lake, as well as the discharge of groundwater into your rivers. Norma- Note that at a river basin scale or at a watershed basin scale, the volumes of water are relatively predictable and allows for practical estimations. Why? Because when you are looking at a particular river basin or a watershed, more or less the precipitation is the precipitation that lands in your watershed, okay, has a predictable destination. So the rain in your watershed will turn into runoff, and then it might infiltrate, or it might enter your stream and then exit through the main outlet, which might go to the sea or to a lake. Okay, you are more or less not losing a lot of water to an ex. The water is more or less not going outside the boundary except for its defined outlets. Okay, so due to the contained nature of river basins, we can assume that the volume of water that is getting in is more or less the same as the volume of water that is getting out. And we can apply the water budget equation to estimate volumes or fill in the gaps of our data. Now note that the water budget equation has many forms. It can be as complicated as including infiltration, base flow, shallow groundwater, deep groundwater, and so on. But for our purposes, we just want a simplistic introduction of the water budget equation. Water budget equation is basically P, or precipitation, is equal to evaporation or sometimes evapotranspiration plus your runoff, and then plus your storage value of your groundwater. Right, so now let's take a simple example here. We have a watershed or a small watershed which directly drains to the sea, and we have the following values of your P, E, and R, which were taken from rain gauges, evaporation pans, and stream gauges. Okay, so precipitation is 10 million cubic meters, evaporation is 3 million meters, and then the estimated runoff is 6 million cubic meters. From those values, we can estimate the groundwater storage as S is equal to P minus E minus R, which is 10 minus 3 minus 6, and that gives us a groundwater storage of 1 million cubic meter. All right.